Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Mark.
Glory to you, O Lord.
Jesus said to his disciples, "Be watchful, be alert. You do not know when the time will come. It is like a man traveling abroad. He leaves home and places his servants in charge, each with his own work, and orders the gatekeeper to be on the watch. Watch, therefore. You do not know when the Lord of the house is coming, whether in the evening or at midnight or at cockcrow or in the morning. May he not come suddenly and find you sleeping. What I say to you, I say to all, watch." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
Do you guys just love Advent? Advent is like the best time of the year. I just love Advent every year when it comes up. And a question that I have for everyone is, what are you doing for Advent? What are you doing for Advent this year? Not looking for like answers out loud, right? But I'm asking you the question, right? Oftentimes when Ash Wednesday comes for Lent, right, we all have an idea of what we're going to give up for Lent. Sometimes when Advent comes, right, all we're thinking about is our shopping lists and our Christmas parties, right? And Advent basically gets completely ignored. So what are you doing for Advent? Advent, as we heard in the Gospel today, right, Advent is the time where we are to be keeping watch. How are you going to keep watch for Christ? How are you going to make it so that this Advent season isn't just about consumerism and shopping, right? And it's really a time to grow closer to the Lord. So some examples. Maybe you want to decide to come to daily Mass during Advent. Sacrificing some sleep, right, to come to daily Mass at 7:30 in the morning. Maybe you want to make a point to spend time in front of the Blessed Sacrament, right, at least once a week. Maybe during Eucharistic Adoration on Wednesdays. Maybe you want to pick up a spiritual book or even a book of the Bible, right? And read a chapter of one of the Gospels each day. But all of us should be doing something every day that is reminding us of the season. Now, what's interesting about Advent, too, is this is something that I just learned recently. A parishioner told me that, we have our Advent wreath over here. And I didn't realize this. I know that, the rose candle, right, it means joy. But I guess every other candle on the Advent wreath is supposed to represent a different Christian virtue. So the first Sunday of Advent is supposed to represent the virtue of hope. Virtue of hope. As I was thinking about hope, as I was reflecting on the readings and reflecting on the season, and I was reminded of a time where I lost hope. I was in seminary, and I was assigned to a parish for about 10 months, and it was in a town in Indiana, which basically, used to be like this booming metropolis, and now it's kind of like a ghost town. Right? So there's a lot of poverty, there's a lot of drugs, there's a lot of broken families. Right? And I was assigned at this parish, and there's actually a Catholic school in the town. And believe it or not, by the end of the year, it was actually really enjoyable. They asked me to be the basketball coach of the junior high team. But you can imagine how that went, right? It was actually, it was really funny. The first day of practice, I was able to get these two elderly parishioners to help me out. One of them had been a coach like 50 years before, right? Like way back in the day, he was a basketball coach. And we were a half hour into practice, and he said, "Man, you really know what you're doing. You have done this before, haven't you?" And I didn't have the heart to tell him that I basically was just on YouTube for like an hour before practice, right? Looking up drills, right, and things to do during basketball practice. So anyway, I was asked to be the basketball coach, but the year started, and it was very challenging. I was teaching the 6th, 7th, and 8th grade religion class, And the priest who was there, he was actually the one supposed to be teaching, but he asked me to basically take over. And so, I observed him on the first day, and it was pretty ugly, right? The kids they weren't paying attention, right? They were very disobedient to the teachers, even talking back. The 8th grade was like the worst class. It was really bad. And, I thought, I've been in seminary a while, I'm kind of close to their age, I'm kind of cool and still with it, right? And so I prepared like this whole speech, right, for the first day that I was going to teach them. And I was going to just light a fire under them. And the day came, and, I prepared, I prayed and everything, and I just nailed it, man. It was like one of the best speeches ever given, you've ever heard, right? And you know how the kids responded? Completely indifferent, right? Didn't change a thing. Right? And so that was a really rough way to start the year, right? And I became very cynical, right, about that 8th grade class. And I basically just resigned myself to the fact that it was just going to be a rough year with the 8th graders. Now, it just so happens that about a month and a half later, the 8th grade teacher was fired. And they were kind of desperate. They were able to find this woman in the community who, she didn't have a degree in teaching. She was still really young. I don't even know if she had like an educational background at all. She basically was like a cheerleader in high school and college, right? This was like all of her credentials that she brought to teaching. And so, of course, when she showed up, she told the principal and me like all these ideas she had, right, to help out the 8th grade class. And the principal and I basically just kind of laughed, like, okay, whatever, right? This cheerleader over here, want to be this great teacher. And sure enough, over the course of the year, right, the 8th graders like completely changed, right? Because of this teacher. This teacher, every day she would come to class, and it's not like she expected them to be like perfect students or anything, but she just consistently believed that as long as she portrayed to them that she saw the good in them and the best in them, that they were going to change. And that's exactly what happened throughout the course of the year. Now, I was thinking about that this week because I was thinking, that's an example of a time when I lost hope and someone who had hope, right, basically like proved my cynical attitude wrong. Another time I was thinking about was, and I think I may have shared some of this with you guys before, but in my first parish when I was in Noblesville, like I was a recently ordained priest, and there was this young mom in the parish who was a recent convert to Catholicism, and she told me that she was starting this internet TV show, and it was on something called Twitch. Right? How many of you have heard of Twitch before? Right? Everybody under the age of 25 probably, right? And nobody else, right? Now, for those of you who are over the age of 25, here's what Twitch is, right? Twitch, so if you're like me, you probably think that like video games and computer games are a big waste of time, right? That's what I think, right? This is coming from a person who grew up playing it, right? It's just a big waste of time. Twitch, if you can believe it, Twitch is a platform on the internet for people to pay money to watch other people play video games. Yeah, right? It's like a big waste of time, right? And so when this parishioner, when this young mom, she was telling me that she was going to start her own show on Twitch. I was like, oh my gosh, what a waste of time, right? And she told me that it wasn't about video games. She was starting a cooking show. People would watch her cook, right? And, I was like super skeptical of this. And, about a month into her having her show, she had like 100 people watching her cooking every day. These people would watch the show for like 3 hours long. Right? And, she was a pretty devout Catholic, right? After her conversion, she had a picture of John Paul II in the background. So, like, people would always ask her questions about Catholicism. Right? And it just kept growing and growing. And about 6 months later, she had 1,000 subscribers. And then all of a sudden, I started noticing that, like, once a month, basically somebody would be coming to Mass with her and her family. And it was somebody who had been watching her show, right, and had been asking questions about Catholicism. And so 5 years later, I can only imagine how many people have converted to Catholicism because of her because of her dumb show. I thought I wasn't supposed to say that word, right? So that dumb cooking show, right? Caught myself today. Apologize. This is a family-friendly program, we gotta watch her. Anyway, yeah, so she was, again, an example of hope. Right? It wasn't like she expected to become famous. It wasn't like she expected a bunch of success. But she believed that just by taking one small step, she could make a difference in those people. Hope is not an attitude. It's not about being optimistic or pessimistic. Hope is a virtue. It is deciding every day to keep moving forward. It is deciding every day to refuse to become cynical. Listen, we live in a sick and wounded world. If you try to live for God, if you try to bring about the good of the world, inevitably you are going to be treated unjustly in some ways. Everybody who tries to do good things in some way is going to be persecuted or ridiculed or criticized. Those of you who have stepped up to leaderships in the community or in our parish, right, you've experienced that. As soon as you take on a role of leadership, all of a sudden it's like you're under a microscope. And there's all sorts of criticisms that come your way. And people easily become cynical. But we're supposed to remain people of hope. You know, one of my heroes about hope is John Paul II. John Paul II, his biographer, he called him the witness to hope. Pope John Paul II. Pope John Paul II used to say that we should always have hope because Christ is always with us. There's no storm that's going to come our way that we're alone in. There's no task that we can endeavor to participate in where Christ is not going to be with us. We always must have hope because Christ is with us. You know, John Paul II, he was just this amazing example of hope. And maybe not everybody realizes John Paul II. You know, I grew up, I was a little kid, right, when he was the Pope. And I just remember thinking, like, man, when you see Pope John Paul II, it's like, God is in front of you. You know, like people used to, the World Youth Days, people would come and youth would come and like, when John Paul II was in front, they would just weep, right? They couldn't stand it being in his presence. It was just, the presence of God was so strong and so tangible. And what a lot of people don't realize is that John Paul II, he suffered so much in his life. Like somebody who had an excuse to become cynical, Pope John Paul II. His mom died when he was 2 years old. When he decided to enter the seminary and he was 20 years old, his father died. So literally for the rest of his life, as a seminarian, a priest, bishop, all those things, he didn't have any parents. He was all alone. John Paul II, he grew up in Poland, and so, you know, Poland became kind of like a central place for all the different wars that were going on. Poland was invaded in 1939, right, to start the World War II. And so John Paul II, when he was going through seminary, the Nazis were occupying his country. And we always hear about how the Nazis didn't like the Jews, but they didn't like Catholics either. And so it was not uncommon that John Paul II, he would find out about his friends, his seminarian friends who had been assassinated or disappeared, had been seen. When World War II ended, right, then what happened to Poland? Then who else came in? The communists. And so all of a sudden Poland became this Soviet country. Right? And this is when John Paul II was a young priest. And even when he became a bishop. And again, I know some of us who are younger here, we might not really have an idea what communism was. Communism was not just a political ideology, it was a religion. It was explicitly anti-Christianity. And so the communists were always trying to snuff out Christianity in Poland. They even appointed John Paul II, they made him a bishop because they thought, you know, he's only 38 years old, he's just this professor, right? What's he going to do? And they were wrong. But one of the amazing things about John Paul II is that he refused to be intimidated by the communists. They had spies all the time outside of his residence. Right? Whenever he would leave to go different places, they would track his car. And he basically became like, you know, he had to like do these moves out of James Bond, right? Or like switching cars around a corner, right? So they wouldn't be tracking him. They would record all of his phone calls so they could hear all of his phone calls. And John Paul II, of course, refusing to back down, he would make a point to talk about how evil communism is, right? Like every phone call with the communists listening. He refused to be intimidated. He refused to be discouraged. He had to run his seminary in the evenings, right, at night when everybody else was asleep. That's when he would teach his classes to seminarians. All under refusing to surrender. When he was finally made Pope in 1979, the first thing he did was he actually went back to Poland. And he knew that was going to make the communists really mad, right? Like, here's this Pope from Poland, and he's going to come back. And John Paul II, again, he didn't pull any punches. He talked all about how evil communism was. So John Paul II was a great example in the face of, political tyrannies, but also he was a great example of hope just when it comes to the faith. I mean, think about when he became a pope. It was 10 years after the Second Vatican Council ended. And those of you who were alive back then, right, you remember some of the confusion that took place. And you remember all of a sudden, priests were leaving the priesthood and religious sisters were taking off their habits. Parishes that used to have 3 and 4 priests were going down to like 1 priest. There was this massive decline in the church. So not only did you have all the political problems going on, but there were so many problems in the church. And think about the youth. What was going on with the youth, right, in those days? This is the aftermath of the glorious 60s. Think about what the youth were doing. And John Paul II, right, this old man who was elected the Pope in the midst of all these difficulties, what did he do? He started having World Youth Days and calling youth from all around the world. And what kind of surprises people when you read about World Youth Days, John Paul II, he didn't try to be trendy. He didn't try to be like hip and with it with the kids. He said, you need to be saints. You need to be praying. You need to be contemplatives. You need to be chaste. You need to be different than everybody else in your society. He was challenging them. And the youth just ate it up. Millions of youth would come every year, right, to see World Youth Day, to be with John Paul II. One of my favorite stories about John Paul II with hope, right? And I'll close with this. And I apologize if any of you heard this story, but it's just such an incredible story of who John Paul II was, right? Always believing in people, and always believing in the church, and Christ's ability to bring about the good. There's this really well-known story about a priest from the Archdiocese of New York who had studied in Rome. And so he made a trip back to Rome, and some of you might recall in those days, sometimes the Pope would allow people to come and dine with him, right, for lunch or dinner. And so this priest was actually able to go to the Vatican and have lunch with John Paul II. And on his way into the Vatican, he noticed that one of the beggars outside, that he looked really familiar. And he realized, he said, that looks like somebody who was in seminary with me. And so he asked the beggar, he said, do you know who I am? Do I know you? And the guy said, yeah, we were in seminary together, we both got ordained, and here I am. I basically went off the deep end. And the guy didn't ask questions, he presumed maybe he was he became an alcoholic or something like that. But he ended up being a beggar, being a priest. And so this priest from New York, right, when he went in to dine with John Paul II, he couldn't help, he had to share this story. And John Paul II, we got to do something about this priest. He's lost everything. He's not a priest anymore. He's just a beggar. And John Paul II's secretary, told this guy on the way out that John Paul wanted him to come back that evening for dinner and to bring this beggar priest. And so you can imagine this priest from New York, right, when he went out and he talked to the beggar priest, the beggar was like, what do you mean he wants me to come in there? I haven't taken a shower, I haven't shaved, I have no clothes to wear. I lost everything, I don't even hardly believe in God anymore. What does he want to do with me? And so the priest said, I'll give you a change of clothes, you can do everything in my hotel, right? And we'll go to dinner. And they showed up for dinner, and about halfway through the dinner, John Paul II, he notioned to his secretary who's there. And he told the secretary to get up and leave and to make everybody else leave the dinner, just so that it would be him and this beggar priest. The Pope and the beggar priest. And so they got up and left, right? And the minutes went by, 5, 10, 15, 20 minutes. Nearly a half an hour went by. And when they came back in the room, this priest from New York was really concerned, man, John Paul must have really been laying into this guy, right? And the guy was weeping when they came back. And this priest from New York, he asked the beggar priest when they finally left, he said, what happened? What did the Pope say to you? And the beggar priest, he said, when everybody got up out of the room, John Paul II, he turned to me and he got down on his knees. And he said, Father, would you please hear my confession? The Pope took this beggar priest who had lost all of his priestly faculties. He had given up everything, lost everything. And the Pope asked him to hear his confession. And he reinstated him into the priesthood. And he told that beggar priest that his assignment in Rome was going to be to minister to the homeless and poor of the city. John Paul II, he never gave up hope in any cause or any person, because he really believed that Christ was with him. I think that's something for all of us to learn as well on this first Sunday Advent.